Hi, this is Dialogues on Building a Culture of Empathy. I'm Edwin Rutsch, and today I'm here with Doug Noll. Thanks for joining me for this discussion.
Welcome, Edwin. Nice to be here.
And so let me give you a little background, a little introduction. I scoured your website, and it says you were a business and commercial lawyer. You turned mediator and then peacemaker. Yay! You have mediation and arbitration practice, and you developed some unique empathic listening skills practices, and author of several books. The most recent one was De-Escalate: How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. You don't have a copy there, do you?
Yeah, if you want to wait a second, I can go get one.
Oh, let's hold on. I should have told you that up front.
I don't have any right on my desk. They're right over here. Whole box.
I usually have a copy that I waive, but didn't have a copy of that one. And then there's also Elusive Peace, how modern diplomatic strategies could better resolve world conflicts, which is a great title. And then you've done a lot of articles on peacemaking, restorative justice, conflict resolution, mediation. Your website is dougnoll.com, and you have various interviews and video presentations that you've made about your work online that anyone can view. So yeah, anything else to add?
Well, that's the 50,000-foot level. I went back to school in the mid 1990s to get my master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies because I was not satisfied with how the legal system helped people resolve disputes. And even though I was a very good trial lawyer, I just decided that was not really going to be my calling. And so that's what caused me to move from being a pretty hardcore civil trial lawyer to becoming a peacemaker and mediator. And the only other thing I'll add is that since 2009, my colleague Laurel Coffer and I have been training murderers and lifers and long-termers in maximum security prisons to be peacemakers. And we are now in 11 California prisons, a prison in Connecticut, and we have a colleague who is running prison of peace in 11 prisons in Greece, and we have a colleague who may be starting prison of peace in Nairobi in Kenya. So if people are interested in learning about that work, they can go to prisonofpeace.org, prisonofpeace.org. It's very powerful work.
Yeah, well, that really ties into sort of the topic I wanted to look at is, building a culture of empathy is just how do we really create a more empathic society in general? I guess I would assume that you're for that.
Right.
And that's something, I'm really for and been working on. And like, how do we really create a more empathic society? And you've had all kinds of practices that you've done sort of maybe at an individual level, but you've also gone into the prisons. And that's sort of a cultural shift, right? You're kind of trying to create a cultural shift, I imagine, in the prisons to make the more empathic society there.
So the broad answer to your question is that empathy is a skill that has to be taught and learned. And true empathy, there are two kinds of empathy: cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And these are skills that are counterintuitive to everything that we think we know about ourselves and about other people. And it's based on neuroscience, not based on myth or history or anything else, old pop psychology, which is totally wrong. And so unless we take the time to learn the skills of empathy, we can't build an empathic society. It's just impossible. I mean, people exhort all the time, we need to be more empathic, more collaborative, more cooperative, more civil to each other. But unless we learn how to do that as a social skill, we won't do it because it's not something that's obvious.
Yeah,
that's kind of where I come from. Mm-hmm. Is, we look around us in this time and we don't see any civility in our public discourse. We don't see any empathy in our public discourse. We see a lot of high emotions and reactivity and anger. So there are no models out there for us to look to learn how to behave. And as a consequence, it's even more imperative that we take the time to learn these skills. And so that's what I'm all about. I finally realized that we're not going to change our culture or our society by looking around for models, because there are none. The way it's going to change is one person at a time. learning the skills, practicing them, serving others, and creating a ripple of peace, one person at a time. And that's the experience we had in the prisons. It's the experience I've had wherever I teach, whether it's at the graduate level university or in the Congressional Budget Office. I mean, you teach a few people how to do this in any given organization, and things start to change rapidly. So that's the secret. And my goal now is to spread this out as rapidly as possible, create as many ripples as I can, with the idea that eventually this will spread at the grassroots level and have a profound and dramatic effect upon our lives, our communities, our families, our schools, everything.
Well, when I came across your work, I got really excited because I said, oh, here's a kindred spirit.
Right.
Because I'm very much along the lines that you're talking about, that these are skills that can be I think they can be fairly easily taught too, at least to get started, and that it's just really about really sort of modeling it and showing people how to do these skills. And like you were saying, you can't just exhort people. There's a lot of, oh, you should be, more empathic. You should be kind. You should. There's a lot of shoulds, like how we should be.
Right.
And that just doesn't do it. It's like, how do we really, implement these skills? How do we, get them, at a wide level, especially now with the political situation, right? It's like, there's just polarization is getting so bad.
Right.
And you are saying to do it at one-to-one, but how do we really spread it, though? Do you have any idea about that in terms of?
There's a project I'm working on here in my community. We're looking for the funding right now, and our plan is, assuming we get the funding, which is very minor. We only need $1.2 million to do this. It's amazing we can't find the money.
Yeah.
But our plan is to train 150 trainers in 2 years. And then in the next 3 years, they're going to go out and train 8,000 people in the community, throughout the community, in these skills. And our experience suggests that if you get 1/10 of the population, 1/10 of 1% of a population behaving and changing in a different way, the whole population changes. And that was pretty well established back in the 70s with the Maharishi effect. And I've seen the same effect in prisons. I've seen 5 or 10 guys in a prison completely change the whole culture of a prison within a year. So we don't have to train a lot of people, but we have to train, a critical mass, which is, like I said, about 1/10 of 1% of a population of a community. So our goal is to train as many trainers as we can, get them out training 10 people at a time, 3 or 4 times a year. And, over a period of 3 or 4 years, see if there isn't some significant change in the culture of the community.
Yeah, what we've been doing, I don't know if you looked at the work that we're doing with the Empathy tent. So we have this tent that we go out to these different political rallies where the political right, for example, comes to Berkeley, kind of the area where I'm at. And we set up this Empathy tent and we offer listening to both sides. When the right wing comes out, Antifa comes to counter demonstrate, and we offer listening to both sides and try to do mediation between the two sides. And so that's sort of how we've been trying to get out in public, to get sort of public attention for this kind of work.
Right. That's excellent. Good.
Yeah. So another thing is trying to get the politicians. I've been looking at how do we get the politicians to do like empathic dialogue with each other. I wonder if you've had any.
Not going to happen. Not going to happen. I wouldn't even waste my time.
Really?
No.
Why? Why do you say that?
Because the nature of politics these days is based on fear and anger, and, as you said, polarization. And no politician in the current state of our affairs is going to become elected on an empathic platform. We just have to forget the public discourse. It's just until there is a major change in the underlying culture. First of all, politicians are not leaders, they're followers. They're going to follow the masses. And so if you want to change the political direction of a culture, you've got to change the culture itself. There are very few examples in history where a political leader has actually been a leader of change. Typically what they've done is seen the change coming and gotten out in front of the wave, so they look like a leader, but they're really not. They're really marching behind the crowd. And that's the problem we have here. I mean, and it doesn't matter at what level of government we're talking about, whether it's at the community level, school board level, even all the way up to national politics. There is no conceivable way that in this time and place with this polarization that any kind of talk about empathy is going to gain traction at all. That's why it has to be grassroots. We have to start in the schools, in the families, in the faith communities, in the neighborhoods, and teach people these skills until they have them mastered. And then generationally, in another generation, we'll start to see the shift as people move up into politics, and we'll start to see a shift. But that's the only way it's going to work. It's a very long-term project.
Okay, so you're really, what I'm getting is you're really convinced it's got to sort of bubble up from the ground level, from the citizen level, and then until that happens, politicians aren't going to.
That's right, and the reason that I say that is because it's based on science. It's based on who we really are as human beings. Our culture has a completely misguided and mythical view of human nature that's scientifically not valid, and it's actually quite abusive, and that is that we're rational beings. And this idea of rationality goes all the way back before the Greeks. The Christian faith is based on this. Augustine said that the only way to heaven is through reasoning and rationality. Kant said that ratio is much better than emotio. I mean, you just look at all of the Western cultural people who have influenced who we are today, and even in today, our pejoratives are, or he's irrational. He's not a rational being. Well, the fact of the matter is, we're never rational. Human beings are not rational beings. We're emotional, and we can't even begin to make a decision. We can't even begin to make a rational decision until we have an emotion first that tells us that there's a problem out there that needs to be solved, and we need to move into our system 2 thinking, which is the algorithmic and reflective processes in our prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, well, I'm totally there with you. It's not I think, therefore I am. It's I feel, therefore I am.
Exactly.
Is the basic premise that I see.
And the problem is that as long as our educational systems are based on this idea of rationality, and I'm not saying that rationality is bad, but that's not who we are. Rationality is critical. We need to have critical thinking skills. We need to understand logic. We need to understand linear cause-effect processing. All of this stuff are critically important skills to develop, but they don't define us as human beings. And once we make the shift to recognizing that we are 98% emotional and 2% rational, then we can start looking at emotions as something to learn about, to learn how to listen to emotions. That's what emotional intelligence is all about. Everybody talks about emotional intelligence. I haven't seen anybody who teaches emotional intelligence. Nobody teaches it. And, I've gone all over the web looking for it, and I see a lot of people who measure it, a lot of people who sort, a lot of people who say, well, this is an activity that might develop emotional intelligence, but nobody teaches the actual skills of emotional intelligence. And except for me. I mean, I don't mean to be arrogant here, but I do have a set of skills that we have proven over and over again, thousands of inmates, murderers. We've shown how we can take them from zero, from being violent people, to teaching them how to be empathic and emotionally intelligent and completely change their lives and the lives of their families and the lives of everybody around them. It's a skill that can be taught and learned.
So
And until we start recognizing that, then we're not going to move the needle at all.
Well,
and that's the secret.
Okay. Well, I'm totally there with you about the importance of feelings. But what about other practices like focusing? The work based on Gene Genlin, who is a grad student of Carl Rogers, and I think his work really sort of taps into the felt experience.
So Rogers, I've spent a lot of time studying Rogers. He was a brilliant clinician. And he was the one that invented the term active listening. But active listening doesn't work. Never has, never will. And the neuroscience shows us why. And so anything based on that 1950s, 1960s, pop psychologist, humanistic movement, all based on myth. None of it is based on neuroscience. And I go to conferences all the time and I present and I talk and people challenge me and I say, well, where's your science? I'll tell you what, I'll show you all the studies that support what I teach. Show me what studies support what you teach. And guess what? They can't do it because there is none. There's only one set of studies that shows what really works. And there are 9 different studies out there that have been published since 2007. And there is nothing else that's scientifically valid that works. Nothing.
So what are those studies? What is it? What is
the study starts with, they're all coming out of Matthew Lieberman's lab at UCLA. The first study is 2007, putting feelings into words. You can just, if you just do Lieberman putting feelings into words and Google it, you'll come up with a study. And then if you go into Google Scholar and search from there, you'll get the 9 other studies where his various graduate students have done various studies around affect labeling and how it works and why it works the way that it does. And these are brain scanning studies where they actually put people into a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner and watch what's going on in the brain while people are emotional, and then de-escalate. They become de-escalated as they go through this process known as affect labeling. And it works. It works every single time because we're hardwired this way. And nothing else works. I'm sorry to say, but nothing else works. I haven't found anything.
Okay, let me get a sense here. So with Carl Rogers, he was using empathic listening, reflective listening. Oh, wait, hold on a second before you get too excited.
Okay.
Take a deep breath. I hear some excitement there. And so he does the reflective listening. And with that, part of that is about being able to identify and name people's feelings, right? Being able to reflect those feelings, as well as the work of Gene Genlin, where he has the whole practice of sort of identifying the felt experience you have and putting words to it and expressing it in moment to moment, following those feelings. And so how is it different than what you're talking about?
First of all, we really don't know what Carl Rogers did, because nobody really recorded his sessions. There are some transcriptions of his clinical sessions, but we really don't have a good database of what he did. All we have is his anecdotal stories about how he worked with clients. And he created this term called reflective listening. But the first major difference between what those guys did and what has now been established to be much more effective is the use of a you statement versus an I statement. When you use an I statement, what I think you're feeling, or what I sense you're feeling is anger, that is not effective. It never has been, never will be. You must use a you statement. You must be reflecting from the speaker's frame of reference. And all of Carl Rogers' work in the human potential movement in the 1960s, if he was using a you statement, which we don't know whether he was or not because we don't have any recordings of his clinical sessions, so we don't have any data to work with. All we have are anecdotal reports. But people started using I statements. And every time I teach, I ask people, what's it like when somebody uses an I statement on you? And to a person, they say, I hate it. I feel manipulated. I feel like I'm not being listened to, and I feel rude. And then we'll go through an exercise of say, all right, so let me listen to you using a you statement. What's the difference? And invariably people come back and say, I feel deeply validated. I feel deeply heard, just by making that switch. And that's a huge difference. Huge. Just that one switch. And the other switch is learning how to sit in silence, and then learning how to read the emotional data fields of the person you're listening to. How do you go about really reading their emotions? And that's the process of cognitive and affective empathy, and learning how to do it. We're hardwired for it, but in our culture, we never take advantage of what we're hardwired for to be able to develop that skill of listening to emotions in a really deep and effective way. So although I admire Carl Rogers, and he wrote some beautiful books, he was a prolific writer. I think he wrote over 50 books. He is not a good model. And of course, none of his stuff was based on science. It was all based on his clinical practice and his anecdotal stories about what happened. But there were no brain scanning studies back in the 1950s. The fMRI machine wasn't developed until 1993. So it wasn't until we could actually watch the brain in action and start testing some of these ideas that we began to see what worked and what didn't work. And so that's why I say, if you don't have science to support your practice, then don't talk to me.
Okay, so for the first thing, there are like 4 or 5 sessions of Carl Rogers where he works with clients online. So you actually see the recordings of how he did it, sort of step by step. And some of them are like over an hour long.
Right.
So he did a lot of samples. So
right, and there are some transcripts in some of his books. There are some transcriptions of his stuff, but it's not much. It's not much of a database.
But we're talking about actual video recordings, so you can sit and watch it. You can.
And so, what are you seeing in those recordings?
I see him, following along the person he's listening to. He reflects back his understanding of what he's.
And what are the words that he's using? Because that's critical.
I don't remember him using "I" or he just. In fact, I even heard him. He seems like I could see him sort of like experimenting with different approaches. That he was actually.
He's looking. He knew he was onto something.
He was actually. He would actually state as if he was the person, like the person say, "Oh, I'm feeling really sad right now," and he'd say, "Oh, I'm feeling really sad right now." So, but but that was where he would do different kind of aspects of it. So it's like,
right. He was experimenting. He was onto something, but for him, it was trial and error because we didn't have any science to really show what was going on in the brain. That's the point that I'm making. And I have a lot of respect for Carl Rogers. He was the one who really fought against behaviorism and Skinner and Watson and those idiots who really disrupted psychology for 50 years in a really bad way. I mean, even when I was in college in the late 60s and early 70s, the psychology department where I went, Dartmouth College, was totally behaviorist. And all my friends that were psychology majors were rats and mazes, right? So Rogers had the courage to step out and say, no, this is what he called client-centered therapy. And he was absolutely right about that. But we should not be looking to Carl Rogers as the model for how we do things. We should be looking at what the hard science is coming out of people like Lieberman's lab that tells us neuroscientifically exactly what's going on in the brain and then what are the interventions that we can utilize to get that effect in the real world. And that's what I'm all about.
I guess I'm a little bit more skeptical about the science, but I see for example, there's studies from Tanya Singer's lab in Germany. So they have the Max Planck Institute, and they do all the fMRI studies. But it all depends on how you're defining things. And it turned out that her colleagues were saying that she was abusive, and she actually got sort of fired. So it's like. I mean, it's sort of a bit of a mess within the neuroscience labs themselves. So I think we got to take a little bit of a grain of salt. I see you really are.
I have to totally disagree with you. Yeah. I mean, I know there's a major war going on right now between the neuroscientists, the psychologists, and the psychiatrists, and they all can't because the neuroscientists is saying, "Look, this is what we're finding, and here's our science to support it." And every year, the techniques for studying what's going on in the brain get better and better and better. And so we're getting more and more refined data. When I started studying this stuff in 1996, 97, I don't think there were 1,000 scanning studies out there. Now there are 1,000 studies published every day. It's impossible to keep up. But if we can't make our practice based on some kind of empirical data that we can look at and say, all right, this is what seems to be going on, then we're just basing our stuff on anecdote and myth and intuition. And that's no way to build a practice. That's no way to change the world.
So you want it sort of based on real physiological studies, like what's happening at a physiological level, and be able to measure and look at that.
That's right. And the reason for that is because human brains around the planet are all built essentially the same. How they're programmed differs, but they're all built essentially the same way. If we can find the foundational processes, biophysiological processes that are going on in the brain around affect, and then the construction of emotion, which is a whole topic all by itself. then we can find interventions and techniques and skills that will work everywhere, because every human brain is going to respond the same way. Now, there are going to be the cultural differences or around display rules and around when it's appropriate to talk about this sort of stuff and when it's not. Totally, that is all variable. And emotions vary from culture to culture. We have words for emotions in the United States that don't exist in Finland. And the Finnish have words for emotion that don't exist in English. Same thing in Central Europe and in Asia. So emotions are culturally created, but it's all based on affect, affect is the physiological state of pleasantness and unpleasantness created in our brains and through the polyvagal system. This is the kind of stuff that people need to be talking about and learning about, because this is the science that tells us exactly what's going on. Everything else, you can say Carl Rogers is great, and I say, yeah, he was a great writer and a great man and a great humanist, but as a scientist, no. And I can't rely on his practice because there's no science to support it.
Okay, so I'm trying to understand, how from his work of using active listening, empathic listening is part of the practice. How is it? And they didn't have the machinery then to measure what was going on in the body. But now you could put someone into an fMRI. You could study, what is going on. So you could measure those effects.
And in fact, that's been done. Starting in 2007.
By who? I haven't heard about those.
Well, that's right, because most neuroscientists only talk to neuroscientists, and most of them are not particularly aware of the deep implications, sometimes the deep implications of their work. But I suggest to you and anybody else who's watching this, go out and get that study and read it. I mean, neuroscience studies can be a little daunting to read, but just read the introduction and read the discussion and conclusion. And if you can get through the terminology, it's very clear that when affect labeling is applied properly, it cuts off the reactivity loop between the amygdala through the anterior cingulate gyrus and into the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It cuts that reactivity loop off, and the brain quiets almost instantly within 30 seconds.
So you're saying that when you're saying affect labeling, you're saying to be able to label a feeling, right?
An emotion.
An emotion.
Correct.
So when you label the emotion, that has a positive impact.
That's what the science shows. Right. And in fact, not only does the science show that, but my practical experience working with thousands and thousands of people, sometimes violent inmates in prisons, sometimes people working in places like the Congressional Budget Office, it works across the board. And I get reports back. I get emails every week from people who have either read my book or take my classes talking about how these skills have completely changed their lives. Completely. So it works.
Yeah.
And it doesn't not work. I mean, I've never heard of a failure. No, I mean, I ask all the time, is anybody having problems with this? No.
Okay,
once they mastered it, works.
So labeling feelings is what I'm hearing you say is the thing that is sort of like the magic.
That's the magic bullet.
That's the magic bullet.
Ignore the words.
Labeling the felt experience, right? Is that work?
Well,
your felt experience. What are you feeling in your body in the moment?
Okay, now you're talking about affective. You're talking about affective empathy. Affective empathy is something that will develop automatically once you develop cognitive empathy. And so when I teach affect labeling, I'm teaching people how to be cognitively empathic. Over a period of time, that will allow them to become affectively empathic, which is much faster and more powerful than cognitive empathy. But again, it's a skill that has to be developed.
Okay, so I do want to kind of, tie this in with the work of Carl Rogers, because that's what he would do. He would listen to people, but he was also looking for the felt experience and naming the felt experience that people had. And there's, there's transcripts of him saying, is it there's a one transcript I remember. It's like, you're upset with your father, and the person is checking their felt experience.
That's correct.
And he says, no, it's not that I'm really upset with him. And he goes through a couple different feelings. Then he hits the feeling, and the feeling is, I'm disappointed in him. I just feel a real sense of disappointment in what how my father was. He didn't stand up for
Right.
himself in the relationship with my mother. And so, the person is sort of searching for the right word and then sort of hits it, and there's sort of this emotional sort of resonance, and you can just feel the energy. And then when they do that, there's sort of a sense of forward motion, something kind of, you're moving forward in your experience to be able to deal with your own emotions.
Correct. And right. And that is affect labeling. Now, it turns out there's a lot more to it than just that, but that is what affect labeling is all about. I mean, one of the things that Rogers didn't understand was that emotions come in complexes. They come in layers. And so whenever you have one emotion, there's almost always 3 or 4 emotions that are underneath that. And so when you're affect labeling, one of the things you're trying to do is go through the layers. There's 6 different layers. And so you're following the layers to see where it takes you. And you're looking for very specific physiological reactions, one of which you described, that are completely unconscious on the part of the speaker. So you're looking for some sort of verbal affirmation like yes or exactly, a nodding of the head, at least in our culture. In India, it would be a nodding of the head this way.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
So, whatever is culturally is, but I mean, well, I'll come back to that in a second. And then you're looking for a sigh and a dropping of the shoulders. These are all unconscious. Speakers aren't even aware they do it. And yet, as a listener, when I'm watching for these, I know that I've unconsciously helped the speaker's brain process through this experience and recategorize the experience from affect into emotion, which causes relaxation. And that's the power of all of this stuff. And that's what the skills that we teach. I was going to say that I have a student of mine who is, she's Swiss Australian, grew up in Switzerland. She now teaches English literature at Sheikh Massoud University in the Sultanate of Oman, working with young Arabic students. And she reports incredible success, affect labeling her Arabic students. And she's now using affect labeling as a way of teaching English literature, looking at the emotions in a piece of literature and having her students really dig into that and look at it. And she says it's really, really effective in terms of teaching them about English literature and how it all works, and amazing results. But the head nod thing, I think she was in Sri Lanka on a vacation, and she reported that she was using affect labeling wherever she was going, and many, many different cultures in Sri Lanka. And she said, the one thing I did learn was that this is yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and we were getting that reaction. He said we were getting that reaction when we would affect label people who maybe only had 50 or 60 words of English, but they still had enough that we would affect label them in English, and they go, yeah, like that.
Yeah, and here I know a friend of mine, he does that when he doesn't agree with.
Yeah, so I mean, so when I say nod of the head, that's obviously a Western thing. So you adapt. You got to adapt all this to whatever the cultural milieu is.
Okay, so I'm going to get back to this Carl Rogers. I see it's more of a direction. He kind of set a direction that a lot of people sort of followed. And, you're talking about, labeling, and, folks like Gene Genlin, he with the focusing practice, he did studies, as I understand. They said, well, let's look at people who are growing emotionally in therapy. Not everybody does. Some people come, they just talk and talk and talk, and it kind of goes in circles. So his insight was that it was the people who talked about their own felt experience in the moment and were able to tap into that and express it, and like you're saying, label it, that they were the ones that had the most growth and working through their issues within.
Right.
So it seems that this is, there's other folks that have been talking about this, and there's also Marshall Rosenberg, with the
No.
Oh, I would like to hear about it, because I'm really interested in what you have to say about that.
I'm going to be very blunt.
Okay, tell me about it.
Communication does not work in highly escalated situations. I took all the NBC courses.
Uh-huh.
They don't work. And there's nobody I've talked to yet who's showed me that NVC works in highly escalated, potentially violent situations. Doesn't work. Never will. It can't. It's not set up right. So Rosenberg was trying to do a great thing in his life, but he didn't have the magic formula. I'm sorry. And I can't tell you how many people I've taught over the years, thousands and thousands of people. One of the questions I always ask is, who's had NVC training? A couple of people raised their hand. I said, how'd it work for you? If that stuff was so good, it would have spread out a long time ago. And it didn't, because it doesn't work. Only the stuff that works will be adopted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are you seeing as the problem with NVC?
It's eye-focused.
Okay, okay,
It's eye-focused. So it might be okay for NVC for your own assertiveness if you're asserting your own feelings, which is fine, and I totally agree with that. But if I'm trying to de-escalate you, I can't use an I statement.
Okay, yeah. I actually agree with that, that I see that the problem with NVC, it's sort of I-oriented. It's like
totally ego-oriented.
It's
totally
for me
ego-oriented.
and my needs. And the sort of the metaphor I use, it's sort of like seeing the world as Pac-Man, that you're going through life as a Pac-Man, kind of going and eating for yourself. And it's not relational. It's not about the culture. And it just really, I really see what,
There's no science, again, there's no science to support his work. Not one study supports his work. He's a psychologist, PhD. Not one piece of science supports his work. There's another perfect example of where somebody came out with some listening idea. He was a good marketer and a good PR guy, wrote some books, got some good PR, and but there's no science. It's all myth and intuition, and I'm sorry, that's not acceptable to me.
Okay.
I'm an empiricist.
So there's like I'm saying, it's sort of a whole, I guess, tribe. There's emotion-focused therapy, for example. There's a whole kind of constellation of these different practices around, which seemed to me that Carl Rogers sort of set this direction. It kind of went in a lot of different ways.
Correct, and most of his work was misinterpreted. And the other thing that's really interesting is that when we're talking about empathy and talking about cultural change, the therapeutic world is a very different world than the world at large. And what skills can we use that come out of the therapy world that might be effective? And I don't know what skills come out of the therapy world. I've taught hundreds of therapists these skills, and they say, how come I didn't learn this back in graduate school? And I said, because the science wasn't there. And that's the truth. And, therapists do therapy. They're trying to help people who have problems, but they're not out there teaching us how to be emotional with each other, how to relate to our emotional experiences, how to relate to us as emotional beings, not rational beings. They don't do that.
Yeah. Well, the thing with what I've seen with therapy is it's sort of this client-therapist relationship. So it's like me, I get paid and I listen to you, and it's sort of this one way. It's not about a mutually empathic relationship.
That's correct too.
I think that's why I called what I'm doing the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy.
Right.
I think that relational cultural aspect is what's missing in the therapeutic world. And we need to be working at how do we create we have to have an awareness of the relationship.
Exactly.
Instead of like just me, and I totally agree with you about NVC. That's viscerally I felt that, and I've just had a visceral, like there's something really wrong here. It's like this Pac-Man. You're just going for me, me, and you never get satisfied there because you're not aware of the relational aspect of culture.
But let's go back to what you're talking about therapy. I mean, it would be inappropriate in the therapeutic relationship, ethically inappropriate, for there to be a bilateral empathic relationship. The therapist is trained to be detached from a relationship other than a clinical relationship with the client. And to have any other kind of relationship is going to violate a lot of ethical rules. So we can't expect the therapist to come out into the world with skills or tools or ideas that are going to do exactly what you correctly stated, which is to have a relational experience based on emotion. Can't happen. So looking to the therapy world for help on this is, in my opinion, going to be fruitless.
Yeah, I don't.
So my work,
I hear that you don't have a lot of hope in it. I see that there's sort of, you get clues and so forth that that you, at least I've gotten, clues
Right.
out of it that I say, oh, this is something I can use. So this
Well,
is,
it is, but I mean, but they're
really
clues.
helpful.
They're not practices that you can teach somebody else. And that's what I'm all about, is teaching people. I mean, look, I make my living as a mediator. I get paid to walk into intractable conflicts where people would rather shoot each other with AK-47s than sit down and talk across the table. And I get paid to calm people down instantly and get them into a place where they can do problem solving. I have to have skills that work every time without fail. And I'm working with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 parties in a room who are really, really upset. That's how I get paid. I don't get paid to heal people. I don't get paid to do therapy. I get paid to help people resolve conflict, deep conflict, intense conflict. And I train people to do the same thing that I do. The only thing that works, the only thing that I can teach is stuff that really works. And the only stuff that really works is based on science, not based on myth. That's where I come from. Very different than the therapeutic world.
Okay, so what is it that you're doing? Do you have like an antidote, or like, what is?
Well, yeah, I mean,
walk us through the
rubric is really simple.
What happens in a?
The rubric for de-escalating somebody is very simple to state. It's not so easy to do. It is not easy to do because it appears to violate a lot of norms. It doesn't, but in the beginning, it does. So the 3 steps are: ignore the words. Stop listening to the words. The words have no meaning. It's just don't spend a moment thinking about the words. Just ignore them completely. And when you do that, a couple of things happen. Number 1, you free up bandwidth, which you're going to need for the second step in your brain. And number 2, you're much less likely to get triggered because you're just ignoring what's being said to you. So if somebody's screaming at you in your face, just ignore what they say. What they're saying is totally immaterial. Doesn't mean anything. Just noise. Then the second step is to learn how to read the emotional data field. It turns out that this is a skill that's hardwired into our brains going back millions of years, long before hominids developed language. But we only developed the ability to have language vocalized 230,000 years ago. Very, very recent development in human evolution. But for millions of years before that, hominids communicated with each other, and they became adept at reading each other's emotions. And so our brains have all the mechanisms that allow us to read the emotions of other people with almost 100% accuracy. The problem is that we're so focused on words in our literal society that we never are taught how to ignore words and simply pay attention to the emotional experience of another person. So that's the next thing we have to learn, is how to read the emotional data fields. And there's a fair amount of stuff that goes into that. But we do have the natural ability to do it, and we can do it quickly without a lot of thought. It's a system 1 process. It's pretty fast and intuitive. And then the last step is to take that information and turn it into a reflection using a you statement. You are angry, you're frustrated, you're pissed off, or you're happy, whatever it might be. And there will be a series of emotions that this person experiences. And so you're going to go through the layers until you get the nod of the head, the the dropping of the shoulder, and the sigh of relief. And you see the immediate calm that happens in about 30 to 45 seconds. That's the process. The difficulty that people have, I mean, you can read my book, but unless you get some coaching on this, it can be difficult, because the idea of using a you statement seems like it's impertinent or rude or manipulative, and especially because in my practice, you are affect labeling constantly. So to an outsider, it looks like I'm interrupting, but to the person that I'm listening to, they feel deeply, deeply validated, even though the outsider thinks it's the rudest thing they've ever seen. So we have to overcome our cultural conditioning and conversation not to interrupt. But what I tell people and what I teach is listening is not conversation. Listening is something else. It's a different skill. And because it's a different skill, different norms of behavior apply. And in fact, when you are truly listening to somebody at the deep level, at the 4th level of reflective listening, which is affect labeling, you want to follow their emotions as they come up in the moment. You don't want to wait 10 seconds or 15 seconds and then sort of state an emotion, because you've already missed 10 or 15 of them that have come by, because emotions never come up just one at a time. There are dozens of them. And our job is to catch as many as we can and reflect them back. And the reason for that is because when people are super upset and they've got this hyperreactivity loop going on, they become alexithemic. They lose the ability to categorize and label their own emotions. So what we are literally doing, and this is what the Lieberman study shows us, is what we're literally doing when we're affect labeling is we're lending our prefrontal cortex to the speaker for the 30 seconds it's going to take the speaker to process his or her emotional experience. And that is the calming effect. And that's what's going on. And oftentimes when you're affect labeling, you're going to sense emotions that the speaker doesn't even know he or she is having. So deep. And so you do that. A lot of times it's grief. And I'll say, you're really grieving. You're really sad. They didn't even know. They were just angry. They didn't know they were grieving or sad. And I'll say that, oh, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly what's going on. And then all of a sudden they calm down. And that's how it's done. And the practice is in learning how to overcome your own anxiety as a listener so that you don't feel anxious about other people's emotions, their emotional experience, and you don't feel self-conscious and anxious about whether or not you're going to get rejected because you're engaging in a behavior that in other circumstances or in other situations might be considered rude or disruptive. And that takes time and effort to practice. Once you get it, it's easy. It becomes effortless, but it takes a little bit of work to get there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if I just recap what I'm hearing is you ignore what people are saying, be aware of the feelings that they're having. What feelings are you getting or the emotions you're saying? And then you interrupt, but this is in a highly charged environment, right? And then you reflect back, you just name the feelings that they're having, and you just kind of keep naming that, and that has a calming effect for the person, and it can happen quite quickly.
Correct. It can be used in any situation. I mean, it doesn't have to be highly escalated. I use these highly escalated, highly emotional situations because that's where the effect is most dramatic. But I've got plenty of parents whom I have taught to affect label their children. Oh, dearie, you're really happy right now. Yeah, I'm really happy. You're really proud of yourself. Yeah, I'm really proud. And I've got parents that I've taught who have toddlers. I say, start doing this at 18 months. And I have dozens of reports of parents, young parents with young children, who say they started affect labeling their 2-year-old, and within 4 months, no more tantrums, no more meltdowns, no more nothing. And in fact, the 2.5-year-old or 3-year-old is now affect labeling mom and dad, which is really cute. I mean, because it's the way our brains develop. We're working with how our brains actually operate. And that's the secret to all of this stuff. And that's why the neuroscience and understanding neuroscience in terms of childhood development, as well as how we process information, is so powerful. I know I get excited about it, but I've just seen so much over so many years, the power of this stuff. And there's another problem we've got, which is that our society and many societies we engage in this persistent and insidious emotional abuse called emotional invalidation. So the story I like to tell is, I tell this to the men in my classes. I say, remember when you were 2 years old and you fell and you scraped your knee and it started to bleed a little bit and you started to cry. What were you told? And invariably, I don't know about you, Edwin, but I was told, don't cry. It doesn't hurt. Don't be a sissy. Be a man. Be tough. Toughen up. In other words, I was told to deny my emotions. And I was told to deny my emotions from the time I was 2, throughout childhood and pre-adolescence and adolescence, and on into young adulthood, because our culture diminishes the importance of emotions. And so what happens when we're programmed that way? We can no longer, we don't learn how to be an emotion, and we don't learn how to listen to other people's emotions. And we wonder why, for example, in the ACEs study, why 60% of the ACEs are all about emotional abuse. I don't know if you're familiar with the ACEs study out of San Diego.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Okay, so I mean, that's all about emotional, 60% of it's emotional abuse of this kind. And it happens in every day in every family, and people are completely unconscious about the fact that they're emotionally invalidating their children and themselves. And again, I have a list that I hand out in my classes, a 5-page list of all these different emotional invalidating statements. And I say, put a little tick mark against every statement you've ever made or every statement that's made to you. And after a couple of seconds, people are cracking up and they say, well, everything. And I said, right. And I said, what's it feel like when somebody emotionally invalidates you? They say, and you're having an emotional moment, and they say, get over it. Don't be a drama queen. Not that big a deal. And everybody says, feels awful. It pisses me off. I get angry. And I said, then how come you emotionally invalidate other people? If it makes you feel so bad, why do you do it? And there are two reasons why we emotionally invalidate. One, we haven't been trained differently. It's what we learned from our parents and what they learned from their parents going back generations. And number two, we are soothing our anxiety around the emotionality of another person because we've never learned how to be calm in the presence of another person's emotions, because our society puts down emotions as being bad, except in very limited, narrow circumstances. And so when we emotionally invalidate, what we're trying to do at some unconscious level is get the other person's emotions to go away to make me feel better, to make me feel calm. And that persists throughout our society. And it's horrible. And it's, it's what causes ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
Well, maybe get some feedback on the practice that I've been sort of focusing on is what I call an empathy circle. So it's relational, bringing small groups together to have mutual empathic listening, where one person, selects who they're going to speak to. They share on the topic or whatever sort of, going on for them. And that person reflects back their understanding of what the person has said till the person feels heard, understood. Then it's the listener's turn to speak, and they speak to someone. So we do this sort of mutual empathic listening, and it's turn taking. To begin with, we have a time limit because people might just kind of go on and on.
Right.
And just as a sort of a first step starting point, I just see this as a place to start, and from here we can start adding these other
I love that practice
tools, and so that's kind of like the main thing I've been trying to do. I've been doing it. We actually did it with politicians. So we had people running for Assembly 15 district, for a state assembly. We had 11 politicians who actually took part in 2 empathy circles, and I'm trying to scale this up where I've been talking to Gavin Newsom about doing an empathy circle with John Cox, and John Cox, who is a Republican, candidate. I called him up just a couple of weeks ago. He said he would do it, and so I'm trying to arrange that. So that's sort of a first step. It seems like something that's sort of a easy first step to get the ball rolling.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we teach peace circles in our very first Prison of Peace workshop. We have 3 basic modules that we teach, and our first one is the Circle Keeper workshop. And after we teach them about restorative justice and we go through these 4 levels of reflective listening, then we teach them how to be a circle keeper. And in our circles, the way it works is that we have 3 questions, usually based on a value, like what is hope? How does hope show up in your life? What can you do to have more hope in your life in the next week? So it's a call to action. And the circle starts, if I'm the circle keeper, the circle starts with the person on my right, who then answers the first question, what is hope? And that person has a talking stick, and when the person is done, he passes the stick to me, and then I reflect back at 3 levels, paraphrasing, core messaging, and affect labeling, what that person said, until I get a nod of the head. And then I've earned my turn. Now I answer the question, what is hope? And the person to my left now must reflect at 3 levels, paraphrasing, core messaging, affect labeling, what I said, until it's right. And then I say, yes, that's right. Yep, exactly. And it just goes around the circle that way. Very similar to what you're doing, except it's a little more, we have it a little more structured. Mm-hmm. We're really trying to focus on making sure that the reflections are really accurate.
Mm-hmm. And that there are different levels.
The different skills that we're teaching. Because there are 4 levels of reflective listening. And so we teach all 4 levels. But mirroring, which is the most superficial level, is only used in certain circumstances. And so in a peace circle, it wouldn't be appropriate for mirroring. But mirroring is used, that's when you repeat back word for word what somebody says. That's when you're repeating back procedures, recipes, lists, instructions, something like that. And you need to make sure that both the speaker and the listener understand exactly what's required. And you would use mirroring for that. You wouldn't use mirroring for anything else. And paraphrasing is just paraphrasing words, which is okay. But you don't start really getting deep until you get into core messaging and affect labeling. Core messaging is the process. You were talking earlier about people who go around in circles and they never seem to talk. There are two things that can be going on there. One is emotional blocking, or the other is they're trying to say something and they don't really can't figure out what they're meaning to say, and so they're just trying to talk it through. And so as a listener, you can listen for what the meaning is and then give them their meaning in a metaphor of 12 or 15 words. And typically that stops them. I mean, they say, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. And then, of course, you have affect labeling, which is where we completely ignore the words and just focus on reflecting emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what you're doing, I mean, your empathic circle idea is a great one. So just keep doing it.
Well, it's very reproducible is what I see. It's something
Absolutely.
that can be quickly reproduced. You can learn it. You can do it with your family and you kind of get the ball rolling. There's a lot of depth, which I think you're talking about. Is like, you can really, it's a lifelong practice to go into, into that depth. But if there's something that we could just quickly get the ball rolling, and, it's something we can do with politicians or, I mean, you're skeptical of politicians. I'm really trying to see if we could get politicians. And I've seen it. I've done it with 11 politicians. And some of them were really pretty good at it,
Right.
So,
well, I'm sure that if you got them into that kind of a circle, they would be good at it because most politicians tend to have some natural empathy because they have to have charisma and ability to relate to people on a one-on-one basis when they're out working for money, right?
Yeah.
So they probably would be good at it. The problem is that it doesn't carry through into their discourse and the way they manage their negotiations and things like that. So
yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, I think that's excellent work, and this is the kind of thing I'm talking about: is doing these circles, your empathic circles, these circles, teaching people affect labeling, getting teachers to do this, getting students to do it, getting parents to do this, and just slowly over time, building up a population of people that are deeply cognitive and eventually affectively empathic.
Yeah, well, one thing to get the ball rolling, is that we're looking at I think we both would like to have a cultural shift where people value those felt experiences. I mean, it's sad. It's, it's like grieving. It's like the lack of felt of what's the beauty of what can be when people really communicate that a felt experience and trust and it's like sad just the lack of that in the culture, and it seems to be getting worse and worse as we go on.
And I'll say that problem fundamentally not creating emotional safety, because all of this is all based on one thing: creating emotional safety around us and having people be emotionally safe all the time. That's a cause, as Kaiser has established in the ACEs study. It's a cause of cancer, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, addictive disorder, alcoholism, tobacco addiction, prison, imprisonment. I mean, all these bad life outcomes can be focused back on emotional abuse and the fact that we aren't doing the kinds of things that you're talking about. It's critical to our society. If we wanted to stop, if we wanted to get rid of prisons, we're not going to get rid of prisons by releasing inmates. We're going to get rid of prisons by teaching parents how to be empathic with their children and teach their children to be empathic.
Yeah. Well, we're definitely on the same path. It's like I see that your vision for creating that culture of empathy is, train a bunch of people who train people who train people. So kind of creating a training which I think is, definitely one of the paths. The other is if we can model it, it's kind of socially modeled. That's what I've seen. If we can get politicians to be like modeling it with each other. But one thing that we did is we had the political right, was coming to Berkeley and San Francisco, and especially after Charlottesville, it's like San Francisco just like went crazy. Nancy Pelosi was all, upset. And I reached out to the right-wing organizer who was coming to San Francisco, and I said, "Hey, would you be willing to take part in an empathy circle with one of the counter organizers, the politically left?" And he said, "Sure, I'll do it." And it took a while. Was able to find one of the left-wing, organizers, and we actually did an empathy circle, online, using Zoom video. And, that had a bunch of views because the right-wing followers, his followers wanted to, see what he was doing. So it's kind of like that is another strategy that I'm seeing. If we can get some of the politicians, maybe, you know, just people who are, you know, have followings and are influencers, if we can have them do these dialogues, this empathic dialogue, that it could model and sort of, you know, create a direction, you know, create some leadership, I guess, or some,
Well,
show this as
here's something, as you say that to me, what comes to my mind is you're there facilitating this empathic circle. What happens when you go away? Do they have the skill set to be empathic themselves and to model empathic behavior without being trained in how to do this? With you there, yes, they model this behavior because you're setting up a set of norms that requires them to behave in a certain way. But outside of your facilitation, they're going to revert back to their old ways unless they get specific training on how to be empathic, how to listen. That's what makes the difference.
Yeah, my hope is that by seeing it, by people seeing it and saying, hey, look, they're actually having constructive dialogue. Because we do every week, we do empathy circles between the political left and right, you know, online. And we have like tons of, at the end we ask, well, how was this, you know, for you? And people say, this was great. You know, people were listening to me.
Right.
You know, I felt heard. I felt safe.
Right.
You know, it's not like those.
All of that, of course, you're going to get all that, and it's wonderful that it's happening. Now, what happens when they leave your presence or they leave the Zoom meeting and they're out there in real life? What skills do they have to continue to do that?
Well, they've learned the basic framework and structure of it. We're creating like training videos, like how do you host your own empathy circle? So you watch it and you absorb it by observing it. I mean, you're just going to pick up your mirror neurons. You're going to, you know, embody it. You're going to see how it works, and then hopefully you'll be interested to, you know, do it yourself.
That's too hit or miss for me.
Yeah. Well, how do you make it more? I mean, I'm totally interested. How do you make it?
I think what you do is you take your empathic circles, which I think are wonderful, and if people really get engaged, then you offer them training.
Mm-hmm.
So look, the next step is to learn how to really listen. And you saw the effect of this when I facilitated an empathic circle and people actually listened to each other. They felt deeply validated. Now, would you be interested in learning how to bring this into your life, every aspect of your life, and serve humanity by being a deep empathic listener? And make the invitation. Some people will say yes, some people will say no. You take the people that say yes and you train them in the specific skills. You hand them a copy of my book or get on my online training or whatever and get them trained. And that's how this stuff will work. I mean, what you're doing is wonderful. It's a wonderful entree into the power of all of this. But that you're just baiting the hook.
Yeah. Well, it's something, but it is sort of baiting the hook, and I agree. You know, that's what we want to do is develop that training. Would love to talk to you more about, you know, the trainings, like, you know, how do we make it accessible? But it seems like it's the first step, like you say, baiting the hook. You got to have the bait, and
Absolutely
it's something
agree.
If we can, you know, because I really would love to work together. Like, how do we, you know, spread this? I mean, the country, the society. I mean, it's just getting so polarized. It's getting so vicious. We have these mass shootings, and this is like an empathy deficit, you know, throughout.
I mean, all those shootings were totally preventable had mom and dad known how to listen to their boy.
Absolutely.
10 years ago. And I can guarantee you, if you look back at the history of those shooters, they were emotionally invalidated from the time they were 18 months old in a really vicious and brutal way. And mom might have thought she was being loving, or dad might have thought they were being loving, but they were emotionally invalidating. They were creating an unsafe emotional environment where the kid felt unsafe, and it just got worse and worse and worse, and just became this vicious cycle where the kid went in and eventually acted out.
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it as well. So it's that culture of empathy. That's why I call it, the culture of empathy.
That's right.
Because it is a whole relational culture. The social systems and structures,
That's right.
The way the whole system is structured, that it brings people into this sort of mindset. It teaches, like you're saying, you know, from the youngest age, that you're shown how emotions work and how feelings work and how to navigate and relate with your feelings. So
that's right.
It's
exactly
really
correct.
Yeah.
That's what needs to happen. And, you know, I mean, it's a long haul because, you know, nobody's ever heard of Matthew Lieberman, the Lieberman study. Or my work. I mean, my work is getting pretty well known in my field, in the mediation field, the ADR field, because I'm very well known in my field. So, and I've presented a lot of workshops and a lot of conferences, and a lot of people know about my work, and a lot of people know about the prison work and in my field. But outside of that, no, people haven't heard about this stuff.
Well, I think that there's a need for our community to be more assertive in the culture. You know, it's sort of like this work has been dismissed, and I'm seeing that we need almost like an Occupy empathy. Like, really, I'm not kidding.
Right.
You know, I've set up
Right.
the empathy tent, you know, maybe 50 times, you know, in different areas,
Right.
you know, around. And I'm imagining like with like Gavin Newsom, I've talked to him twice about doing an empathy circle. You know, he's kind of evasive. Is like, I want to set up the empathy tent on the Capitol lawn, you know, in the state capitol, say, I'm here until, and whoever else, until you're willing to take part in an empathy circle. You know, be assertive about taking part in this. And we already have, you know, John Cox willing to take part. You know, to kind of so
part of this is a marketing problem and public relations problem. And what I found over the last 20 years is the media hates peace, and the media hates stuff like empathy. They're not going to cover it because what sells eyeballs is conflict. And I mean, when I was writing my third book, Elusive Peace, one of the exercises that I engaged in was I looked up old news headlines around international peace conferences or international mediation efforts. And it was really interesting. Without exception, would say like, peace conference convenes in somewhere, right? Let's say Nairobi. Peace conference convenes in Nairobi between these warring factions. Big, high-name person from the UN shows up. And then they'll have two sentences about that. The picture will be tanks. And then the rest of the story will be about the conflict, the war, the bodies, and all that. Not about the peace process, not about what the issues are, not about what would be needed to bring peace to the table, but all about the war.
I saw that exactly. I experienced it viscerally in Berkeley when the political right came, and then Antifa, you know, counter demonstration. It was like knock down, drag out, street fights there.
And look at how the media covered it.
We had the empathy tent there, and then a fight would start on one end of the park, and it was the media. They were literally tripping over themselves. They were running with their cameras, tripping over themselves to get to the fight, almost like sharks to a feeding frenzy. Right. And then they'd be all circling around this one fight. And it's like, here we are, like talking to people, you know, showing empathic listening. And it's like, oh, good night. But this is where the action is. And then it'd be a fight on the other side, and they'd go running over there.
That's right. Peace is boring.
So embarrassing. I mean, it was like, I would be just embarrassed to, you know, just to, you know, be that way.
No, this is how they make their living. And peace is boring. Peace does not sell eyeballs on the internet or newspapers or magazines or anything else. And you can have your empathy tent right there, and there can be fights on one side of your tent and fights on the other side of your tent. But the reality is the media is going to completely ignore you. Just as you stated. And that's been my experience.
Yeah. But I think that one of the things, because we're kind of maybe strategizing here, because I think we both have the same intention of kind of spreading this into the culture. I think it's kind of doing Occupy type strategies. That's where the that's where the empathy tent started, was we set up at Occupy.
The Occupy movement was,
So it's a disaster. That's why we went there. That's another story. But it's like, you know, Occupy the Wall Street Journal, and not the Wall Street, New York Times, you know, to say we want the journalists, we want them to take part in empathy circles, you know, and we're not leaving until you take part, you know. But
well, and then you might get a nice article in Atlantic Magazine, but you're not going to get a front page article in the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's not going to happen. That's why I focus at the grassroots. Training, because eventually there will be a critical mass reached, and that's when things will start to switch. But it's not going to happen top down. It's not going to happen from the media. It's not going to happen from some celebrity getting up and say, oh, what these guys are talking about is really phenomenal, and so I'm all about empathy. It's not going to happen that way. It's going to be happening from people learning these skills, mastering them, practicing, and having it become just a part of who they are every single day. That's what's going to change.
I think it's more of a multifaceted approach, that there's the training, but it's like we can work at different levels, and they need to sort of support each other. So
of course, but I don't see. And obviously, if you go out and can continue to create a presence that eventually get people curious, maybe even get the media curious, that's great. That's not the way I work, but I understand what you're saying, and there's merit to it. So,
well, okay. Well, I don't want to keep us over. I could talk for a couple hours.
Obviously, so can I.
I'm glad to do it, but I don't want to keep you over. If you got other things you have on your schedule, because you said an hour.
Yeah, I got a pretty full day, but okay. I really enjoyed this a lot. It's been very interesting. So
yeah, it's like you really know your stuff, and I think there's a real we have the same sort of vision of this more empathic world, and trying to move towards that. And it's certainly where we need. I feel it's like it's the only way for humanity to go forward. And
if we can't figure this out, we're going to kill ourselves. One way or the other. Either we're going to strangle ourselves on bad air, or we're going to cook ourselves in heat, or get washed away from ocean rising, or we're going to shoot each other. I mean, we have to learn how to use, and we have the ability to do this, but the ability has to be released through training.
Yeah,
it's not intuitive.
And sort of getting the motivation to do it. You're talking about global warming and climate change. We started working with Extinction Rebellion. I don't know if you've followed them. If you look up Extinction Rebellion, they're really big in the UK, and it's spreading around the world. And I'm sure you'll see a lot of occupations in events, coming in the fall. And it's going global, and they've been shutting down areas of London and all over UK. They've been getting tons of media in the UK, and they're really wanting to, so cultural shift too. And they're doing stuff called the People's Assembly, which are more democratic processes, and they were very interested in empathy circles. So I'm developing some stuff with them. We have like a work group for that. So I'd love to keep in contact with you, especially around the training. Like, how can we get the training out there and get it spread? And they're very appreciative and really sort of see the importance of sort of this mind shift happening.
Right. Good.
Great. Okay. Well, great. And I think I mentioned your website, dougnoll.com, and there's links down below for anyone who wants to, find info.
You can Google me. I think I don't know how many Google pages there are on me, a lot. So I'm pretty easy to find. I'm got the usual social media presence, so I can be found.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Thanks.
Okay, Edwin.
Doug, pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.